Hello everyone and welcome to the Kentucky office of Archer Point. This is Faithy Robertson. I hope I find you today happy and healthy. I'm going to take you through a brief demonstration of how you would use the Excel automation functions code unit to add Excel output to the inventory valuation report. First, let's take a peek inside the code unit. In the documentation trigger, you're going to see that there are various functions listed and a brief description of what they do. Hopefully this will help you use it as a table of contents for the function. You can use the find command if you wanted to look for a specific function to be called and what it is. Or you can just go through and browse through it and make yourself comfortable with the different things that it does. When you come to the bottom of the code unit, you're going to find some special functions. For example, Excel begin hide, Excel make visible, keep going down from there. This is where they start. I found as I went through and created several reports using this code unit that there were certain functions that I called repeatedly. So what I've done is just combine them into one function to decrease the amount of code that you have to put into NAV to add Excel output. There are two ways to create a report in NAV, hidden or visible. The Excel begin function will create it visible, while the Excel begin hide will create it as invisible. Why would you want to make your spreadsheet invisible, you say? Simple. Think of Excel as a car. NAV is going along, NAV is driving the car, it's writing to the Excel report, everything's great, it's at the steering wheel, and suddenly your user gets curious and decides they're going to click on the spreadsheet and see how many rows have written. Guess who's now driving? Not NAV. NAV doesn't like that. NAV gives you a big fat error, and it stops writing to the Excel spreadsheet. So what do? You simply lock the user out of the car. In order to do that, we create the spreadsheet as invisible. Now all this does is turns off the GUI interface to Excel from the user and allows NAV to be totally in control of writing that report. When it's done, you're going to run a little function called make visible, and it allows the screen updating to be done and the GUI to come back to the user, and then they can take their spreadsheet and do whatever they want to do with it. It prevents errors in NAV. Now, I've kept this one in here, the Excel begin, in case you happen to have a spreadsheet that maybe it creates 10,000 rows. And maybe you don't want to see it run all day long. You're going to take a sampling of those rows. This is a way to do it and stop it at the point that you or your user decide to do. So that tells you the two methods that are here. We're going to use the invisible method today. Now, when we create Excel reports, we do so in three different phases. First, we write out the headings of the Excel report. Then we write out the column headings. And then we write the details. Now, when we write out the headings of the Excel report, you have to keep in mind that this is going to have a life of its own. After it leaves NAV, people are going to want to know, hey, what filters were used for this? Why don't I see part number 5200 here? You're also going to need to store things away, such as the options of the reports in the case of the inventory valuation, the as of date. You'll also want to write out the date, time, and user. And I always put in the company name as well. Then, of course, the next thing you're going to do is write out your column headings. All of this is done in one Excel function that you call from NAV one time, because it's the same for the entire report. Secondly, we will write out the detailed lines of the report. You'll notice in the sections of the actual Navision inventory valuation report that there are options such as printing variants, and that changes the layout of your report. For our purposes, and because most clients don't seem to be using variants, I'm not going to include it here. However, if you use variants, there's no reason you can't add the variant in this single line. Sometimes when you're looking at taking the NAV report and converting it to Excel, you have to reevaluate the layout to be in a row manner. For example, there may be a piece of data that's in a heading, like a group heading. You don't want to put groups of data into an Excel spreadsheet, because then if your user wants to sort them, those group headings are going to be gone. So you have to go ahead and add them in the actual lines. For example, if I wanted to add the inventory posting group, I would do so here rather than coming into my spreadsheet and putting in little breaks throughout it. That's not going to work when I sort this data now, is it? Because it's not tied to the row. In fact, the beauty of using Excel is that you are in charge of the entire spreadsheet layout. Do what you want to with it. Have you ever had a NAV report that becomes so big that it won't fit on the NAV preview screen, even in landscape mode? Guess what? With Excel, the sky is the limit, or at least a column XFD in 2010 version. If you get one bigger than that, don't call me. I can't help you. Also, when you're writing NAV reports, don't bother putting in the totals. Putting the totals in also becomes a problem because your user can then not sort the data because the totals become irrelevant. Just leave them out and let the user take control of the raw data. Now, when we finish writing out our report, it's going to look something like this. When you're outputting Excel reports from NAV, the standard Excel column format is what you're going to get. Now, we don't want that. We want to be able to go in and set an auto width on our columns. We don't like that on our column A because it becomes the width of our largest field. So in column A, we're going to call a command that's going to allow us to set the size of column A separate from everything else. And you'll see a sample of that shortly. Now, over time, I've found that I can just copy and paste the commands used in each NAV function into the report, change a few things, and I'm good to go. I've also found that I typically get the same globals to a report for Excel output. So what I've done is gone into the very bottom of the Excel function code unit and just created a deleted code set. Notice right here, warning, 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 all this code is deleted, and I don't like using the brackets. They're just ugly. If I'm way down here, I have no idea this line is deleted, and that's why we don't use them. However, because I have all these warnings and because I'm telling you up front it's deleted, I trust that you will remember that this code does not get executed. So what I tend to do is open this up, and I come in here and I view my locals, and I copy these out and then stick them in my report. And I'm going to open another window here so that we can see these together. And there they are right there. By just copying them in, they're already set up. You don't have to wonder about which ones have multiple dimensions. And oh yes, there are some there. It's just so easy to do. And we definitely don't want to make this hard, right? So let's get started. We're already in here. First thing we're going to do is we're going to go through after we create our globals, and we're going to add 3 different functions here: sheet setup, sheet detail, sheet summary. These are going to contain all of our code related to calling Excel functions. We're also going to go in and on our request page or our request form, we're going to add create Excel report, and this is just a little Boolean field called, yeah, you guessed it, create Excel. When the user comes into the report, they have the ability to pick and choose when they want Excel and when they don't. Now, we've got the bones to what we're going to do in there. So let's go ahead and we're going to add the code to call our functions. On the on-pre report, I want to insert just a simple little statement that says if create Excel, then sheet setup. Sheet setup is going to write our report or Excel report headings, titles, that top part that we talked about earlier. In the on post report, I'm going to call sheet summary, which is our function that creates our column widths and everything at the very end and makes the spreadsheet visible. Now, where do I write my details? Well, in this situation, it just seems easiest to do it on the exact section that's printing the details. So if Excel, then sheet detail. Now, we've got all of our little calls in for our functions. It's time to add some calls to the Excel functions. So we're going to go down here. And I've already done this, so I'm just going to show you how it's done. By coming into the CodeUnit, this tells you that we're looking at sheet setup fields, right? You're just going to copy this stuff in, and then you're going to change where I say insert your sheet name to inventory valuation. And here we're going to also call this, since this is the title of the report that prints, inventory valuation. This is going to automatically put in your company name. If you have report filters, build those into a variable called report filter with code strings like if item.guildFilters not equal to blank, then report filters equals item.guildFilters, right? Now, if your report has options, which I've deleted this code because it's not always needed and I don't want it there if it's not being used. But if it does, you're also going to check the option to see what it's set to or if it's set. And then you're going to write that out to your report as well. And then, of course, we're going to want our date, our time, and our user ID. Now, once we get the title section done, we're going to start writing our column headings. Very, very simple code. Right here is all you need. The first one, notice, we're starting the column counter at 1. That's column A. And then we're going to insert our column heading. If you want your font to be larger than 10, change it to 12 to 14, whatever. This is the color of the background of the column heading. And then you can set bold and box, which are variables, and it will either bold it true or put a box around it. In my code, I've set these to be true, and they're going to be bolded and a box put around them. Now notice when you write your second column heading, you're incrementing the column counter by 1. That means for each additional statement like this that I process, I go forward 1 column to the right. And I'm going to change my column heading as I go. Of course, when you're ending your column headings, you're going to want to turn off your bold and your box so that your data doesn't come out bold. I always add this at the bottom. This is to keep track of what my last column written was. And that way later on, when we want to set the auto width of all of our columns, it won't take as long because we're not looking at the entire spreadsheet. Okay, so that gets us through what we're going to write into our sheet setup, which is right here. Notice I've copied them in inventory valuation for my spreadsheet as well as my sheet name. I've added item filters. I've added the quantities and values as of and the as of date because that's an option. And then I've gone through and I've listed every one of my columns that I'm going to print. And I've turned off my bold and my box and recorded my last column. Now, that takes care of the top part. All we have to do now is the sheet detail. And here we are. Again, if you look at the code unit, in the sample section, I've actually put in the sample code that you will need to just add your detail lines. Notice again, we're starting at 1 and we're incrementing by 1 for each additional column. I always format, change my variable to text, and then pass a string here that within the Excel write column data function will set the format of the data. The reason I do that is because you want your leading zeros to stay on numbers that are text or code types. It seems to work out better. So we go through and we add all of our columns of data that we're going to print. We've got the item number, description, unit of measure, all the way down through here. Now, remaining quantity, I did a little something different here. I don't want to always show decimals. Now in NAV, you can control that with the decimal places, 0:2, which means I either have none or I show 2. However, in Excel, not so easy. You need to test each field if you're going to make that kind of change, and you have to make the decision before you write the value. So what I'm doing is simply determining if when I take my remaining quantity and I divide it by 1, do I have a remainder that is not equal to 0 or 0? If I don't have a remainder, then it's an integer. But if I do, it's a decimal. And that just simply tells me which way to output remaining quantity, with or without decimals. The last thing you want to see is 5 decimals on a remaining quantity that are always 0. It's just going to fill the page with extra stuff and make it look hard to read. And of course, unit cost you're going to want usually to show with 5 decimals, so that's the way I've done that. And then, of course, when you're done, you're going to want to call this single little string from your sheet summary. This calls the function Excel end from the code unit, passes the sheet number. This is the value that we want to use as far as the first column and how wide it's going to be. Within Excel end, it's automatically going to auto width everything so that Excel is going to determine based on the widest contents of the column what the width of the columns will be. But then it will look at this 14 and say, okay, now I'm going to reset my column A to a width of 14. And it's going to save it to the file name that you give it as well. Let's go back and take a look at that. Oops, way too far to the right. And that's all there is to that. So, how's it work? Let me show you. And we're going to get out of this too. No need in keeping screens open. I'm going to run this. And that gives me something that's going to show up as a filter. I'm going to run it as of today. Yeah, I'm going to give it Excel output, of course. Now, if I'm going to use test, I got to close it. As you can't write to one that's open. I could pick any file name I want. Notice NAV is still creating its report, and NAV finishes before Excel does. Notice the invisible mode, and now it's visible. Voila. Didn't take too long, did it? Have fun with the CodeUnit and get creative with it. You'll love ways that you can use it to do various things. Have you ever wanted to add color to a NAV report? Well, guess what? You can't, but you can do it in Excel. For example, maybe you have a unit cost that suddenly rose dramatically and you want to point that out. Guess what? You can color it red. I've done things such as create a single page per customer report with a chart on it that shows the salesperson, the inventory posting groups in a pie chart that customer is buying so that they know best what the customer's buying instincts are. There are a lot of things you can do with it. Just be creative. Enjoy it. Until next time, stay happy, stay healthy. Goodbye, friends.